Hello, YouTubers. Hello, Ukrainians. I'm a Useful Idiot. Welcome. And today I want to talk about what's going on in Ukraine, what apparently is the other massacre going on in the world, and very disturbing events. And Ukraine continues to be a very disturbing country. So the ongoing saga of Flight MH317, of course, continues. And but to focus it back in on the big picture, we have this offensive closing in on the Donetsk region, the final showdown between the separatists and the Kiev Ukrainian government forces, if you can call them that. A lot of figures have been coming out. There's a lot of economic factors involved, and layers of narratives. So let's dive right into it. So first of all, we have a document that came out that purports to talk about Ukrainian government losses in the field in this assault on these rebellious eastern regions of Ukraine. And the report says that they've had 1,600 killed. So before I go back into the numbers, I think the scale of this will probably surprise a lot of people as well as it did me. So killed 16. This is just the Ukrainian government losses. Killed 1,600, wounded 4,723, 35 tanks lost, 96 armored vehicles lost, 38 artillery pieces lost, 7 aircraft, 2 helicopters, and 104 automobiles. So fairly substantial losses for this assault on these breakaway regions. So it gives it a lot more perspective on the fact that this is definitely a real war on every level. Not to mention that we see the modern total war leveled against civilian population and a lot of non-military targets being involved. And certainly the integration to a degree of the military units of the opposition within the civilian population, but certainly not to the degree that we see in other areas, but here it sounds eerily familiar. So then we go on to the government calculations for total militia losses, and they say 48 killed, 64 wounded, 2 tanks destroyed, 5 artillery pieces, and 8 automobiles. And so that's fairly minimal losses for the opposition. So once again, we see a strangely lopsided offensive action going on here. Fairly small amount of militia losses, but of course this is the government giving the figures, so they could potentially even be inflated. And the government claims that only 496 civilians were killed and 762 wounded, which of course far outnumbers the amount of military deaths in these eastern Ukraine regions. But according to the UN, 1,129 civilians were killed and 3,442 wounded. So once again, some pretty high levels of destruction, and you compare it to Gaza, for example. This is half of half or more or less of what we see in Gaza. And once again, cities being and villages being reduced to rubble, and a huge refugee crisis. So we have thousands of Ukrainians leaving that region. And I've attached a number of videos below exhibiting all the things I'm talking about. And some of it's from Russia Today, so there's going to be a certain amount of extra pathos and propaganda value, but it doesn't change the fact that there's a refugee crisis of a lot of homeless Ukrainians moving to Russia. And not only that, we have massive defections. There's a couple of big stories that have come out recently. One just recently is 483 Ukrainian soldiers said that, quote, said they were tired of war and no longer willing to fight, unquote, and supposedly destroyed their weapons and ammunition depots before leaving Ukraine. But that's hardly the whole story, even though that's getting the headlines now, because last July another 40 Ukrainian troops defected to Russia, and then back in March of 2014 in the turnover in Crimea, over 5,000 to 8,000 Ukrainian troops defected to Russia. in April after that, April 2014, an elite Ukraine unit defected to the pro-Russian separatists. And not only that, the Ukrainian government, of course, has a conscription right now, a draft, and there's a lot of opposition to that, but they have to keep filling the ranks because they're also having massive desertions. And that shouldn't come as a surprise either, because the Ukraine government's sending a lot of cannon fodder into the field without much food and water and ammo by reports, and so morale is low, especially as the campaign goes on. I'm sure a lot of times they can get somebody involved promising the campaign would be short, and also, of course, when they get there, they see the realities of what work they have to do, and perhaps it's not so appetizing. So then on top of that, we have massive desertions, and alone July 14th through the 19th, 3,500 soldiers deserted from the Ukraine army. And one of the officers in the Ukraine army said that within 4 to 5 days, he expected 2/3 of the deployed Ukrainian forces to desert. So they have an attrition level of 47%, really staggering. So this is a comedy of errors in a lot of ways, except for, of course, the death and destruction. So let's get back to the comedy. Now we have Kiev spending $6 million a day on the war, according to the Kiev government, and they've even levied a temporary military tax of 1.5% on the working citizens' wages, and they're expected to raise $241 million. And so if they're spending $6 million a day, and they have that tax to raise $241 million, you would think something would go right. But of course, since Ukraine has one of the most corrupt governments on planet Earth, a lot of that $241 million raised by those taxes will probably disappear, even though they're in the midst of being saddled with a austerity and an IMF loan that's going to be cutting social programs and has very harsh conditions indeed. They're shedding 24,000 government jobs, raising taxes, selling off state assets, and wage pension caps. Of course, selling off state assets means all Western elites are all swooping in to pick the carcass of Ukraine while they're busy. And this is a great situation for them to do that in, because the elites love buying all these assets when they create these failed states. And some of them are like Greece, and some of them are like the Ukraine, where they can swoop in from a desperate, failed, broke state and start the exploitation process again. Because let's remember that when the Soviet Union broke apart, Ukraine and all the other regions, ex-regions, had a bloodbath of privatization, and that's why we have all these oligarchs in all these countries that got rich off of that. And certainly a lot of Western elites are also getting rich off that same process in these same failed states. And let's make no mistake, that's the overall big picture that I'm driving at, is that Ukraine is a failed state. And once again, the United States finds itself on the wrong side of history, supporting a fascist, neo-fascist government, perpetrating overwhelming firepower in the eastern regions that could be categorized more as a massacre than a war in some respects. And all the seediness of the state comes down into this war, and so we end up with all these atrocities, and there's no moral compass. And on top of that, the IMF says the Ukraine economy will shrink 6.5% this year, and I would put forth that it's going to probably shrink a lot more than that. And once again, they had a $17 billion bailout over the next 2 years, and they're deteriorating faster than they can keep up with it, and therefore they're going to need a second bailout. And to make matters worse, now they owe Russia money for past gas bills, and now they have to pay as they go. And Russia has been relatively generous and still offering them a good rate. But now they have to, so their gas hasn't been cut off, they just have to pay as they go. So, and then let's not forget that we have a failed government of this failed state with these resignations and the dissolving of Parliament. And many of the key positions are now held by these neo-fascists and these thugs from Svoboda and the like, including people in charge of the military operations. And so we have to once again listen to this ridiculous United States narrative of us supporting democracy in Ukraine and a bulwark against the menacing empire desires of the evil next Hitler, Putin. Quite an extravagant characterization and all this propaganda towards Putin and Russia and their involvement in Ukraine is really hypocrisy on the highest levels. The United States is completely responsible for everything that's unfolded in Ukraine and everything that continues to unfold in it. And like I say, once again, like so many other places in the world today, the United States finds itself on the wrong side of history, propping up a failed, violent, brutal, corrupt, neo-fascist government that has no moral compass and will only serve as a feeding ground for transnational corporations and elites of the West. That's about all I have to say about that. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.